morning, treasure hunters and explorers. Today, as promised, I'm going to talk about signs and symbols, treasure signs and symbols, petroglyph meanings, and other types of informational things that were left by different groups, whether it's a rock pile, a rock cairn, or a tree symbol, or something of that nature. First of all, there's some pretty decent information out there about petroglyph meanings. I know the Spanish had their own code of petroglyph meanings, and I think that these things are probably carefully hidden in the archives somewhere. Some of them seem to be pretty straightforward, and there's been some, I think, some fairly accurate surmisation or some fairly accurate information about what some of these mean. And I think there has been a lot of misinformation as well. Now, I think that this is something you're not going to hear from anybody else. This is my own idea. I've come up with this for various reasons. I've come up with this because of my own personal experiences and observations I've seen, projects that we are working on, and things that have been recovered and found. I think that the standardized Spanish glyph meaning mainly pertains to things that belong to the king or the crown, or perhaps a mission. I do not think that individual miners, individual mining families, individual treasure-seeking families or individuals used a standardized sign and symbol treasure cache or mining information. I do not believe they had a standardized mean or method, for obvious reasons. If there was a standardized method and somebody else came along that knew this standardized method, they could follow the information from a panel or from a tree carving or from a glyph directly to the mine site or to your cache. And it's not going to be there when you return, or it's going to be mined out. Now, when you really think about these things, you realize that if these signs and symbols exist on an individual basis, that they can take the standardized signs and symbols and use them to their advantage by spreading misinformation, reversing things, adding all kinds of little things in there that will totally confuse anybody that might be looking, while at the same time the person that made this cache and has the document that explains it would easily be able to return to their cache or their mine location. Now, I want to back up a little bit and explain why I think that there was a standardized method for the king. And I think that while these miners and these explorers and these treasure hunters were out there, all the ones that were legally chartered by the king, all the ones that had legal documentation and the legal ability to be in the field doing these things, had to pay their quinto, their fifth, their 20% to the king. The king's percent was protected by guards and the law, and I don't think that your average miner or individual was going to try to mess with anything that belonged to the king. Now, there's always that individual, that person that's brazen or out there in the middle of nowhere and would be willing to steal these things. But my personal view, my personal thought is that these miners, these padres, these missions that were in the process of mining and getting gold and silver bullion, that they had a separate cache site or location that was for the king, for the crown, for the quinto, and that they deposited this treasure, this cash, into a vault that was specifically for the king. And yes, I do believe that there was a standardized means or method that these miners or padres had to have for this king's cash. Now, it was probably held quite secretly and close to the chests. It was probably a very well guarded secret at the time, because the king would not want this information out there. But I believe that the representatives of the king, that there were shipping companies that consisted of mules or burros and a individual that was guarded by strong soldiers that would traverse around the West to all these legal mines and missions and recover there the king's fifth, the king's treasure. I do not believe that it was the padres or the miners' responsibility to ship to Mexico, to the coast, the king's fifth. And if anybody has any information about that, I'd be interested. But from my research and experience, I believe that this was primarily the responsibility of the king himself. Now, this makes sense from a couple of standpoints. First and foremost, if you were a padre, a small miner who had a legal operation, and you were responsible for bringing the king's fifth to Santa Fe or Albuquerque or somewhere, and you were attacked by bandits, Native Americans, the French, or any outlaws that were in the area, you could be robbed, killed, and the king would lose his fifth, his gold. And human nature being what it is, the hazards of the traveling back in those days in the remote and rugged wilderness, just getting back without having a wreck, whether crossing the water, going through a canyon, or being attacked by natives, I think was cause enough for the king or for those who were maybe funding these operations for these people to have a system in place, or a organization in place that went around recovering their precious metal, their goods that were being produced or that they were responsible for funding. I think they made sure that they got their percentage, their interest, their quinto. And I think that they had a company or a system where this took place. And I've found evidence in some of the areas where we find these caches, because the same signs and symbols that we find in one of these cache areas seems to exist in the same signs and symbols in another cache area. And I know of 3 or 4 like this. And they all have on them, these similar sites, all have a sign or symbol indicating the crown. Whether it's a heart, or a cross with crown, or a cross with a circle, or some other indication of the personal indication of the king at that time. Whether it's, the name of the mine system, or whether it's the name of the company, the signs and symbols seem to indicate that there is a separate cache for the king aside from the actual miner or priest that was in the area mining. It just makes sense that these caches would be, and it makes sense from the point of view of the actual mine owner themselves. If they had a king's cache that was separate from their own, and a representative of the king showed up to get his percentage, then they would be protected by saying, the king's percentage is right here. and they would already have the documents or the information, or would be given the documents and information how to recover that. It wouldn't be the priest's responsibility to go dig it up or to go recover it if he had cached it in a correct manner. It would protect what he was doing. He wouldn't have the soldiers rifling through his gold or silver cache in order to make sure that the fifth was paid. All he merely would have had to do was keep a log, a record of what was mined, and then point to the king's cache and they could recover the amount. Did these miners, these padres, fudge on the king's amount? Human nature being what it is, almost assuredly I think they probably did. And they probably cached what they had in several small caches rather than in one big location, because if the king ever demanded for them to recover and to prove that they had not been fudging on their numbers, all they had to do was merely go over and dig up one of their caches or uncover one of their caches, show it to the soldiers and say, you know, if they were keeping anything over and above what they legally should have, they were not going to cache that in their main cache. They would put that in other little caches around to protect themselves. That's just my thinking. And so, getting back to the signs and the symbols, I think that the private individuals had their own system. If they had caches that they were concerned about being able to come back and recover, or a family member or a relative or another individual in their organization, they would have their own special secret signs, symbols, and means of recovering that. It would be a case-by-case basis. And I believe that those sites are more difficult to understand, more difficult to find, and more likely to actually have something there than the king's cache sites. I think the king's cache sites were probably recovered on a regular basis. I think they had a more successful trip to Mexico. I think that they also I think that the cache sites that are more likely to remain in the field is where a padre or a miner or a family that was mining died of natural causes, were attacked with an Indian revolt because they used a lot of the natives as slaves in their mines. And so, or from like a hard winter or a really severe drought, where their animals died and their crops didn't make it. And I think that these missions, these miners, the areas that they were mining in, if they could, they tried to live there year-round and have a cabin there to protect what they had. They obviously would want to stay near their mine, near their cache, and when they did go out, they would try to take everything they could with them, rather than to leave portions of it. Now, there's probably a lot of instances where there was too much to take out. Maybe in some of these instances, the areas they were mining at higher elevation in the mountains, that the winters were too severe and they had to migrate to lower country. And therefore they would have leave caches in that higher country if they weren't able to get it all out before winter. And so I think that the best possibilities for the average treasure hunter to find something are these smaller caches that don't have distinctive treasure signs and symbols associated with them. I don't think anything was standardized. I think there was a twist on every sign or symbol, or there was a unique meaning. Now, the earliest Jesuits, there's even evidence that the earliest Jesuits used the Native American petroglyphs with a twist on them to hide cache or indicate treasure or where they left something. But only they knew how they had warped, twisted, or manipulated these petroglyphs. But one of the ways that we can know that they are from a Jesuit or a Spanish is because there are certain symbols that are included in there that the Native Americans never used. And a lot of times these are very subtle. I've mentioned crosses. I've mentioned that, the Native Americans very, very seldom would use a cross symbol. They would not use a sigla, a sigla that matches a family crest from Spain or from Portugal or from other countries that use these signs, these family crest symbols, to indicate the ownership. And I have several instances of siglas that are carved into petroglyphs. Now these siglas, if you don't know what they are, they're very subtle and you wouldn't recognize them as a sigla. But if it was your family, you would recognize, that sigla would stand out like a beacon when you got to that site and looked at it. You'd be like, look, there's Grandpa's sign. There's our family crest, where it looks just like a Native American sign or symbol, and these crafty Spanish or Jesuits may even turn the sigla on its side or on its head. But no matter how they turned it, if you know what that sigla means, you're going to recognize it when you see it. Now, before we really get into some of the meanings, I want to talk about petroglyphs, Native American petroglyphs, for a minute. Native American petroglyphs seem to be a very mysterious topic. And ethnologists and anthropologists, archaeologists that have interviewed tribal groups and native groups trying to understand the reasoning or how to understand these petroglyphs are in many instances told they don't know what they mean. They don't know who made them. And in some instances this may be true. They may not know who made them. They may not know what they mean. But in other instances, I believe that the natives know fully well what they mean. They know fully well who made them. And they just aren't willing to tell these anthropologists their sacred family history, their sacred meanings and methods. They're not willing to reveal what these things mean. And so we're left to kind of learn how to discern and find these things out for themselves. Now, some people have said that the Native American petroglyphs are just doodling, that they're, on one spectrum people say they're just doodling, or done when they're high on peyote, and on the other hand you have these groups that say that they're a writing method, that it's ancient script, that it's a common meanings that all the natives understood at one period of time. Well, I think that the truth is somewhere in between. Whether it leans one way or the other, I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think Native Americans, just like all humans, did do some doodling. And I think that the Native Americans, just like all humans, they had very special, specific signs and symbols that meant specific things. Now, the very site that these things are found in almost certainly can give some meaning behind whether it was doodling or whether it was something that was very important. Now, doodling by Native Americans was probably done superficially. It probably was done not to last. It was probably done in an area where they didn't care whether the erosion, the wind, the elements got to it and destroyed it rather quickly. I also think that in very special, specific locations where things were protected, where it was hard to get to or the site was special to them, sacred or otherwise, that doodling was prevented, probably prohibited, and not allowed. And I think that just by going to the site, looking at the surrounding country, looking at how well it's been preserved or the type of protection it has endured, you can tell whether this is a significant site or, you know, some scratching or doodling. And I honestly don't think that the Native Americans did that very much. But there are some sites that I have seen that, you know, it's hard to say that it was anything other than doodling. Now, was there now one thing about the Native American petroglyphs that I firmly believe is the majority of the panels are a combination or a mix of many different ancient languages, script and text and writing. You can find everything from Chinese to runes to Egyptian figures, and you can see these things, many of these signs and symbols you can see found on every continent in the world, nearly every continent in the world. For example, let's talk about the spirals or the concentric circles. You can find the spirals, the concentric circles on every continent, among every native group, on every part of the world. They have a universal meaning that has been passed down, that has been used. Perhaps it's become a little bit different here or there, but for the most part I think that it remains the same. I think that the circle going one way means go up. And the circle going one way means go down. The circle going this way means go up. This concentric circles mean within or down into the earth. I think that that's a universal language, and I've often shown in my videos some evidences of that from the Nazca lines, where they have the spiral that's actually carved into the ground on the mountaintop, or the spirals going down to the water hole into the wells. You have the example that I gave of hiking into the wilderness, seeing the symbol to go up, climbing up, and there's a spring with a broken pot to get a drink of water from. I don't know how much more simple than that you can break down a petroglyph than that. You see a symbol that says go up, you go up, there's a spring with a bowl to be able to get a drink of water. There's been a couple of books written that I think could be important for people that are trying to study these things. One is The Rocks Begin to Speak by Levan Martineau. I have personally never read the book. I don't own the book. Someday I will. Someday I'll read it. But I have specifically myself refrained from trying to be influenced by anybody else's interpretation of these things. I have researched them myself. I go to the sites, I look at them, I try to understand them, and I have learned many things that way. And I have my own means and methods of interpreting them, and they have been proven correct to me many times. Some people have said that the petroglyphs are not maps. They're not map rocks, but they are writing rocks. I would have to disagree with that because, in my opinion, many, if not most, petroglyph panels have some situational, some locational elements to the panel. And some of them, and quite a few of them, are specifically maps to sites, to significant features, or for a remembrance to significant things that happened or significant locations. So I think almost every panel, the location itself is significant. So that in and of itself says something about location. And many of these sites also have either the entire site or specific parts of the site are maps. And I can prove this in two different ways. First of all, I can go to these sites that are map panels. I can take the things that they've put on these sites. I can overlay them with Google Earth, and I can physically show you features on the ground that match the features on the panel. It says go here, go around, go up. You go here, go around, go up, there's a spring. You go here, go around, go up, come down, there's a weird shaped formation. There's the formation on Google Earth. You go around there and there's another petroglyph panel. Or you go around here, there, around, and there's a pile of rocks indicating a grave. In those instances, I've just proven that that petroglyph panel was a map. In another instance, I can tell you. When I was a newly married, I rented a home from a old timer. He's passed away now. He lived and existed in a time before the Antiquities Act, way back in the time and period when Native American sites were routinely dug up by pot hunters and people looking for treasure or for interesting artifacts. He worked on the Glen Canyon Dam, which basically created Lake Powell. And him and another friend of his, as the dam was completed and the water was coming up, they floated around with a boat and got into all the canyons, all the side canyons and things that were inaccessible before the water was raising, and they pilfered and looted a whole bunch of Native American sites that were going to be covered up with water. Honestly, I don't fault them for that, even though, you know, that's looked upon with some, you know, disdain by anthropologists and stuff. The disdain that I have was that the anthropologists actually let the waters of Lake Powell come in and cover up all those Native American sites without first studying them, recovering the artifacts, and presenting that information to the American people and to the Native Americans themselves. The information about their ancestors. I think that was a great travesty. But anyway, this particular old timer, he would get into these sites and these caves, these overhangs, and they would dig up and find the Native American artifacts. And he found some very, very, very significant artifacts. And I saw many of them in his collection before he died. And in many instances, he told me that he would find petroglyph panels, and he learned from these petroglyph panels where to find the hidden sites that were hidden up, whether it was higher in the cliffs or down around the corner, or where things were buried. He said there was specific location in the petroglyph panels that told him where to look, where to dig, where to search. And I guess, you know, he found the panel, he found the site, they excavated the site, he remembered the panel, wrote things down, and lo and behold, he found that the site that they dug was actually, the map was a copy of the site that they dug. And the things on the map showed where the things were in the ground or under the ledges. And so after that, not only were they looking for these sites that they could physically see, but they were looking for the petroglyph panels, and he got to where he could interpret and know and understand what many of the things in those panels meant. And he told me some of those things. He explained what they mean and why and how, that 90% of the panels that they found, the petroglyph panels, were literally panels. They were literally map panels. And then he gave it as his opinion that the others that were not map panels were informational panels recording things that had happened or recording significant events for the ancestors, for the following generations, or they were sign panels telling other groups, this is our area, this is our group's area, stay out. Somebody lives here, somebody has claimed this area, this land. They could be sign panels to tell how to get a hold of or to find these people to do business with them for trading, or it could be a warning of imminent danger. If you come into our area, you're going to be killed or, suffer the consequences. And so from the things that he taught me, he gave me some very closely guarded secrets that he had. And he said that most of these panels that they found were map panels that led to significant finds. He took some of that information, and so after Lake Powell filled up and they couldn't do any more, excavation or discovery in that area, he took that information onto land, into the canyons and into the cliffs all over southern Utah and Nevada and Arizona. And they used this same techniques and information and found thousands and thousands of sites that contained artifacts. And then as the Antiquities Act came into being and this, became illegal and fell out of vogue, he went into doing something else. He went into logging. He was a skidder operator, and his name can be found all over the mountains that he operated on, all across the desert southwest in these forests. The Kaibab, the Boulder, the Fish Lake, the Pine Valley, up on the Panguitch Lake, the Dutton, all these areas where any logging went on in the southern part of Utah, the northern part of Arizona, the Four Corners area, you can find Del Barney's name carved. Okay, getting back to the signs and the symbols, I did an exercise one time that was very valuable that really helped me to understand some of these things. I decided that I was going to invent my own signs and symbols to explain everyday life around me. And so I did this exercise where I created, several pages of signs and symbols and attributed a meaning to them. What was very interesting about this exercise is after I did this, I went to many petroglyph panels and suddenly started to understand what some of the things there meant, because I had attributed in my mind as I created these things a meaning that seemed to be common to the Spanish or to the Native Americans or to any people. There's only so many things that can describe human life. Food, water, animals, love, children, genealogies, burials, maps, sacred sites, religion, relatives, enemies, travel, fishing and hunting, traveling by boat, unusual things that they might see or come across, like meteors or the stars. There are solstice panels and meteorological panels, whether it was of a meteor shower or just the times and the seasons that they needed for planting, for growing, and for traveling at night or navigation. And so the same common themes that we have as human beings to survive, if you break those down, they are the same common themes that the Native Americans and the people that use these signs and symbols had. Like I said, that there was a twist. If the Native Americans probably put a twist on things, if they were from a different tribe than another group, and they didn't want the other group to know what they were saying, they put a little twist on the things. The same way that the Spanish, if they were trying to hide things from the king or from other Spanish or from other miners, they would put a twist on their sites and their symbols, and they would keep the key. I'm going to show some photographs and some things of what I think the meanings of some of these things are, and some of the common themes that you'll find in treasure sites and in petroglyphs that can tell you where things possibly could be, but you have to uncover and unlock the rest of the story. And that's why it is so important for treasure hunters today You can get into the area, you can use this information to guess or to make various educated guesses, but it really takes technology to cross off a site for you to feel like that you have actually covered the site and there's nothing there left to find. Now I've mentioned before that there are some interesting things like the cap faces that I believe are actual warnings to people. Stay away from here. I mentioned that Native Americans use some warnings, like Defiance House. If that's not a warning, that petroglyph isn't a warning to anybody that comes around that area, then I don't know what is. And the same thing, the Spanish and the Portuguese and other groups that were mining or treasure hunting, they had warning signs. Anyway, the cap face is a curse, a curse put on a tree to protect that mine that it's facing or that treasure cache from anybody else. And there's a specific ceremony that goes along with that curse. And so signs and symbols are very important. They're very important when you're returning to country after many years. I think that there were some standardized means. For instance, like I said, with the king, I think that the miners and the padres had this standardized thing for the king's caches so that they could recover their treasure. And I don't think they were worried about somebody else finding the king's cache and treasure, because if they did, they were liable to get their heads chopped off. Those things were stamped. They had the siglas on there. They had the quinto removed or shown that it had been taken out, whether at the coast or previous to the journey. And so all those things had to be marked on there for any legal ore to be mined or to be used. And so I don't think that the miners were that concerned, or the padres were that concerned about hiding the king's treasure. So there was a standardized means or methods where these vaults were, and their own were probably in a very unique hiding system, and there was no standardized means.